Welcome back to Making Money Matter, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kerry Stevenson. I'm your host. And today I've asked Siobhan Lancaster. She is the Managing Director of 92 Energy. But this is not going to be a presentation about 92 Energy. Sorry, Siobhan. This is going to be the beginner's guide to exposure to uranium. You know, what's uranium? What makes a good deposit? Where is uranium located? Why should we care? Why is it zero carbon emissions? That is a really good point. And how do you get exposure to the different types of uranium? And scratch your head and go, I don't even know where to get started. Well, I'm hoping that with Siobhan's help today, we can break things down. And, you know, I've asked Siobhan to talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old, because a lot of people out there go, I don't even know where to start. What is even uranium? So, Siobhan, I really appreciate your time because I know you're busy. And, you know, just briefly, I know we're not going to talk about 92 Energy, but you are, the ASX code is 92E, big exploration up in the Athabasca Basin. But that is for another show. For this one, let's talk uranium beginners.
Great, Kerry. And I'm super excited to do this for everyone because, you know, I think it's a very important topic and it's an often slightly misunderstood sector. So I'm really happy to talk about it and give you the bright light and run through about why this sector is so important for everyone to pay attention to right now and, of course, going forward into the future.
You said something just then where you said that it's misunderstood or it's not well understood. Why do you think that is?
Look, let me bring you back to the basics here, right? So uranium is used for nuclear energy, right? So it goes into the fuel rods that creates nuclear energy. And nuclear energy, as you may or may not know, actually powers about 12% of the world's electricity. So it's actually a huge amount of electricity produced through nuclear energy. And there's certain countries, you know, who really are very heavy into nuclear energy. So, for example, the US are the largest users of nuclear energy throughout the world. It produces 20% of their energy and up to 50% of their carbon-free electricity, which a lot of people don't realise.
Wow.
So there's a few benefits of nuclear energy. The main benefit being is that nuclear energy produces carbon-free 24/7 baseload energy, right? So this is something that is really really coming into vogue again through politicians around the world who are trying to figure out, well, how do we decarbonize our electricity system? And how do we do that in the most cost-effective manner and produce the most reliable energy source for our constituents? Now, there's been examples around the world, for example, Germany, who've really gone in very heavily into the renewable space. But of course, as many people may or may not understand, the problem with renewable energies is it is not 24/7 baseload power. So the problem with renewables, for example, is when the sun doesn't shine or when the wind doesn't blow, the electricity doesn't get produced, which means you have to have a backup energy source, which is baseload energy. Now, there's really only two carbon-free baseload energy sources out there. One is hydroelectric, so that's basically your dams, and the second is nuclear energy. And nuclear energy has one very distinct advantage. It has a very small footprint in terms of, you know, the area of ground that you need. So you can basically, if you've got a coal-fired power station, for example, switch it out for a nuclear energy station and just plug it right into your transmission lines. So it's a very effective way of producing electricity. It has a very small footprint in terms of land holding. And of course, it produces lots of that 24/7 carbon-free electricity. It also goes sort of 95% of the time. So I think with renewables, you're looking between 20 and 30% of the time upon which they actually operate, which doesn't really suit people running big cities around the world. If you're, you know, heavily manufacturing or anything like industrial based, renewables is really not going to be that helpful for that. So this is a way that governments really around the world can go and solve that problem. And so we have nuclear energy all around the world. It's already there. 12% of the world's energy is nuclear energy. And there's a real renaissance to increase nuclear energy around the world. So we're coming up to COP28 next week.
Oh, that's next week. Okay.
Yeah, and COP28 is actually obviously looking at, well, how can countries around the world reduce their carbon emissions? And one of the cornerstones of COP28 this year is that the UK and the US have basically said, we're going to triple nuclear energy by 2050, right? So triple the amount of nuclear energy. And what they're trying to do is get all of the other countries to sort of come into that sort of whole way of thinking, right? So Australia is very much on the fringe in the way Australia is thinking. You have, the Americans, you have the UK, you've got the Canadians, you've got the French, basically all of the big countries around the world. UAE has actually just started 3 nuclear power plants. They're a great example of how you can decarbonize a grid very quickly using nuclear energy. So the Middle East is looking at it. You've got obviously China, who have the biggest nuclear build program throughout the world. Yep. So China is going to have more nuclear power plants by 2050 than the whole world combined, which is fantastic for reducing carbon emissions. If you think about how they're increasing the amount of energy or electricity that they use every year, this is really going to go a long way to helping solve those carbon emissions, which is fantastic because, as we know, China is one of the biggest, or is the biggest, emitter of carbon emissions in the world. So it's fantastic that China has chosen to go down that path. The US choosing to triple and go down that path is also a cornerstone of really reducing carbon emissions around the world. So it's exciting times.
It is exciting times. We'll get into some more bits and pieces around that. But one of the things I wanted to ask you is, if we did do that transition, and I want to get into some basics as well, because there's literally, from, I guess, an exposure to uranium, I want to talk about that. But if governments around the world started to get more excited about this zero carbon nuclear energy system, do you think that would bring prices down? Is it
prices of what? Uranium or
no, price of electricity? Price of electricity.
Price of electricity. Look, I definitely think it will, because I think renewables are, basically they put a lot of pressure on electricity grids because, as I said, you've got to go and find that base load energy if the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't, shining. And the problem, of course, with renewables as well is when it's super windy, you're getting a lot of electricity going to the grid. If at the same time it's really sunny, you're getting a lot of electricity going to the grid. So you have these situations where you've got too much electricity going to the grid, but all at the wrong time. So the good thing about nuclear is it sort of has a nice consistent sort of flow of electricity over time. So that actually reduces costs quite significantly when you don't have like peaks and troughs of electricity. And you've really got to look at the cost of the whole system. So a lot of people talk about the cost of renewables and they're like, oh, it's so cheap, but it's not. Because if you look at the cost of the whole system, how much are the transmission lines going to cost? How much do the, renewables cost to install? When are you going to have to replace that? I mean, one of the big things about nuclear energy is it can literally go for 80 to 100 years. So when you build
when you say it can go for 80 to 100 years, what do you mean by it?
The nuclear power plant.
Look like?
Well, it's the nuclear power plant.
Okay.
So provided, it's kept as it should be, which, of course, they have a lot of the nuclear engineers working at it and keeping nuclear power plants in pristine condition, then they can run forever, quite literally.
But are they hungry beasts? Again, talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old. Do they need lots of uranium to feed the beast? Like, for example, a coal-fired power station needs quite a lot of coal to create electricity.
Well, I think the easiest way to describe this is, for a coal-fired power station, 80% of the cost of electricity is the actual coal that goes into making that energy, right? Whereas nuclear power, it's so energy dense and so efficient, only 10% of the cost of nuclear energy is through the cost of the fuel that goes into it. So
Okay.
every 2 years, they will replace the fuel rods. And like you get these little uranium balls that get made into, pellets, and they go into these fuel rods, and that's how they actually then they go into the nuclear power plant, and they get replaced every couple of years.
Okay, let me take a step back, if you don't mind. Uranium can be found all over the world, and I think you've got a slide which can actually show our audience where uranium is located around the world. Because I want to see that, and then I want to understand, or our audience will want to understand, is okay. That's great. It's all over the world. Let's step through the process, if you like. So first up, let's have a look at this slide. I love how Australia is completely obliterated by a big blue dot. Talk to us about this slide.
Okay, so this is identifiable, recoverable uranium resources, right? So I'll just move that. So you can see Australia has 28% of the known uranium resources in the world. Now, a lot of this is due to Olympic Dam, which is one of the largest uranium resources in the world. And of course, we know Olympic Dam is a copper deposit primarily, but uranium is produced as a byproduct from that Olympic Dam mine. So that produces about 9 million pounds of uranium a year.
And we shift that offshore, do we?
Yes, all of that uranium goes all around the world to various different fuel purchases. But of course, we don't use it in Australia. So there's nothing more ironic than producing all of the resources for something and then not actually using them yourselves. But, this is a story sort of really told around the world. If you look at Namibia, they're a huge producer of uranium. They've actually produced 12% of the world's uranium in 2021, and they don't use nuclear either. So, Namibia and Australia are both in the same field, and Kazakhstan as well. They produce 41% of the world's uranium, and they don't use it either. So nuclear power either. So it's kind of ironic. Canada is actually the only producer of uranium and user of uranium, really, out of those major producers around the world. So
sometimes humans can be really strange. That's all I'll say about that. I mean, we will get into a little bit more later, but okay. So that's really interesting. This is the areas where uranium can be found. You just mentioned that down in South Australia, they export about, how much was it? 9 million tons?
It's about 9 million pounds a year. And they have a couple of mines in South Australia. So there's obviously the Olympic Dam, which produces it as a byproduct. And then there's Heathgate Resources that have the Beverley mine. So they produce uranium a couple of million pounds, I believe, a year out of that deposit. And then of course we know our friends at Boss are about to start production. Yep. So that is about to get restarted in South Australia, their Honeymoon deposit, and that will be producing around 2 million pounds of uranium a year as well. So South Australia is the golden child of uranium mining in Australia at the moment. Of course, we were producing an ERA, Ranger, through ERA. In the Northern Territory. So that was a uranium mine for many years, which is now it's now been rehabbed there in the Northern Territory. So the Northern Territory currently have no uranium mines, but lots of uranium resources in the ground. So like many parts of Australia, West Australia has a huge amount of uranium as well. There's a lot of 1 million plus resources in Western Australia, a lot of pretty good resources in the Northern Territory and South Australia as well.
And of course, down the East Coast, where I am, sort of Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, there's a total ban on even looking for uranium. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I think there's a ban on exploring for uranium in New South Wales and Victoria. I'm not sure if there's an actual ban on exploring for it in Queensland. I don't really know too much about it, but I know you certainly can't dig it out of the ground.
Right. Well, then it's pretty much ridiculous. So again,
Yep.
all right. So Siobhan, going back to um, the nuclear energy, we know what it's used for. We know it's zero carbon. Why is it zero carbon?
Yeah, look, it's that's a great question. It's just an extremely efficient way of producing electricity. Now you'd need to really talk to a nuclear engineer, but you're basically boiling water is the best way of describing it. It's like a big kettle, and you're producing the energy from the boiling water basically through that. So I don't know whether that's a great description. Sorry if I offend
No, no,
anyone
no.
out there.
You keep talking to me like a 5-year-old. We will be just fine.
But that's basically what it does. So very simplistically, it's just very, energy efficient. And, even if you compare it to any of the renewables, it is the most renewable form of electricity actually out there. So if you look at the renewables, they obviously have to dig all of the components out of the earth and then go and produce, the wind turbines and the solar panels, etc. And actually they only last 20 years. So if you look at the total lifespan of, nuclear energy and the amount of fuel that goes into it, it produces the least amount of carbon emissions out of all of the electricity out there. Maybe hydro is very similar. And of course, it's actually slightly renewable in that all of that spent fuel could actually be, put back into a future fuel rod going forward if the economics were to work.
Wow. Okay, that's interesting. Now, listen, it's not just within that sort of electricity. There's different ways people can get exposure to uranium, isn't there? There's can you just because my audience out there is an audience that are looking for opportunities, but this is a guide to uranium. But there's uranium because there's uranium in the ground, which is explorers, developers, and producers. But there's also other ways that people can get exposure.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess this cycle is slightly different to the last cycle in that you've got the Sprott Physical Uranium Trust and the Yellow Cake, which is also a uranium trust, and a couple of other uranium trusts, which is where you can actually purchase into the trust and you're really holding the physical uranium product as part of that. So Sprott, for example, has I think 80 million pounds of uranium in the kitty, which they just store on behalf of trust holders and unit holders. So that is a way that you can just play the physical uranium price if you'd wanted to. There's also the ETFs. So there's two main ETFs in the uranium space, and they're both North American based ETFs. One is URA and one is URNM. So again, you've got Global X Uranium ETF, and URNM is the Sprott Uranium Miners ETF. And they basically are doing the diversification piece for you where, they invest in, a variety of different producers, near-term producers, developers, explorers, and they diversify that risk for you based on, what they think the best holdings are. So that's another way to play it. I think the best way to play it if you want to get some really nice leverage and upside is to go out there and look at the miners, the near-term producers, and really just pick which one you think is going to be the appropriate one for the cycle. If they've got a new discovery, for example, and you think there's lots of potential upside, that's a nice way to play it with leverage. So there's all those different types of ways that you can play the game, and I'm not promoting one over the other.
No. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, just to be absolutely clear, this is not financial advice. This is us just down ways of looking at exposure to uranium. But you've got to go out there and do your own research. But as Siobhan just said, there are different ways to look at it. You've got ETFs, you've got the Sprott Fund, you've got the physical uranium fund, then you've got the miners, the producers, the explorers. And Siobhan, of course, is in the exploration category at the moment, and I'm going to get into that at the moment. Before we get into how uranium gets from, in the ground into a facility, before we do that, why do you think it's a good investment right now? Just curious of your view. And again, ladies and gentlemen, not financial advice. I'm just curious as to what your view is, I guess, on the supply demand and the where we are in the cycle.
Yeah, look, I mean, I've never seen the uranium market set up like this before. So just to give you some context, I was around during the last uranium cycle through my job at Extract Resources, who, of course, had the Husab deposit, which we sold to CGMPC for $2.2 billion. And then, of course, Fukushima came along, right? So we've had 10 years of no exploration or development of any project. So I think I said in the last presentation that I gave that the last big mine to come in production was that Husab uranium mine, which is pretty extraordinary because, that was sold 2012, I'm going to say. So, there's really been no new mine developments in that space of time, which is pretty amazing. So that just shows, uranium has really been in a bit of a funk over the last 10 years. And the reason for that, obviously, Fukushima happened.
But to be clear, Siobhan, sorry to interrupt you. I think this is very important for people to understand. Fukushima was not an issue with the nuclear energy plant. Fukushima was an earthquake in the ocean, which caused a tsunami, which caused a number of deaths. But because people assumed the nuclear plant was affected, then it was a nuclear energy issue. It wasn't. It was an earthquake followed by a huge tidal wave of water, which did extraordinary damage. I just want to make that absolutely clear. But the sentiment as a result of that absolutely put the sector onto the back burner for, as you said, a decade.
Yeah, look, I mean, it was pretty terrible in terms of the way the media looked at nuclear energy as a result. So the anti-nuclear proponents came out and really went out hard. And of course, we saw the shutdown of nuclear energy in Japan. And then we saw the shutdown of nuclear energy in Germany and parts of Europe. And of course, Germans, as we know, have had a lot of power in the EU over the years. So that sort of played into the anti-nuclear sort of space in Europe for a long time. But in any way, I say that because what happened was we had a whole bunch of demand come off at the same time that we had a whole bunch of supply come on. So the Kazakhstans had just started producing a lot of uranium. Husab started producing uranium, and this is all, of course, based on the fact that we thought nuclear energy was going to increase on the demand side, and of course it didn't because of this. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is there has been really low prices in the uranium space for a really long time. It hasn't incentivized new players to come in. It hasn't incentivized new discoveries. It hasn't incentivized new production or new mines to be built. So what we have now is a situation where there's actually less uranium being produced than what is actually required on the demand side of the equation. Now, it's very easy to work out uranium demand because all you do is add together all the nuclear power plants and figure out how much uranium they're going to need for it. So, it's an inelastic sort of concept in that, it doesn't change if the price goes up or down. It's like they just need it, right? So we already know that we're producing here and the demand is here and there is a gap in the market. Now, for the last so many years, there's been a secondary supply in the market, right, which has covered any gap. And that secondary supply has now all dried up.
Oh, wow.
So we have a situation right now where you're seeing the spot price rise dramatically, and that's driven by utilities who are actually trying to buy uranium and driving the price up. And the long-term contracting price has been steadily going up as well. So you can see if you look at the chart for purchasing uranium that long-term contracting has gone up to the highest levels since Fukushima, And as we know, contracting begets the long-term price increases as well. So we're at this sort of tipping point where a huge amount of contracting has taken place. The spot price has moved up dramatically. The long-term pricing is moving up dramatically. And we have literally the tightest uranium market out there. So basically, the Chinese, they already own 2 of the major mines in Namibia. And they've gone and purchased a whole huge amount of the Kazakh product. So the Kazakh product now is completely sold out. You've got Cameco's product, which is completely sold out. Now, of course, Kazakh, as I showed you in that previous slide, they have 42% of the world's uranium. Cameco produces a huge amount of uranium. They're at 12% of the world's uranium. So, some pretty significant sellers of uranium now are sold out. So where do you buy your uranium from?
Well,
and what does that do to pricing?
Goes up. But I want to ask you, you mentioned long-term contracts. For those of us that don't know, when you say long-term contract, is that 6 months, 6 years, 60 years? How does that work?
So the spot market in uranium tends to be sort of spot to midterm is sort of anything between 0 and 2 years, and then anything beyond that is a long-term contract. So it's basically a forward purchase of uranium out into the future, and those contracts can go for up to 10 years. And that has always been the main way of purchasing uranium until Fukushima occurred, and there was a whole bunch of excess uranium in the market suddenly. So everybody sort of stopped contracting for a while and was just purchasing a lot of that uranium requirement on the spot market. Now, what's happened is that spot market has dried up, and so people are going back to long-term contracting, trying to secure that uranium that they've got. And I guess the importance of that is you want to make sure that you're going to be able to, have enough fuel for your nuclear power plant. So traditionally there's been floors and ceilings in uranium contracts. So a floor would set the lowest price that you would sell for, and the ceiling would set the highest price. My understanding now is those ceilings, not only have they gone up tremendously, but they're also sort of starting to do away with the ceilings, which really shows that it's a seller's market in the uranium space at the moment. So a lot of exciting stuff. Those floors have moved up dramatically as well. This all goes to show that the market's just getting tighter, and people are willing to pay more for the uranium at the moment because they just want to get the supply of it. So in summary, great space to be, running out of uranium, not too much coming on the market. The gap gets even bigger. It's cumulative, so the gap, I think, until 2030 when NextGen's deposit, the Arrow deposit, comes online. So that's meant to bring 20 to 30 million pounds of uranium on a year. But of course, we all know that the supply and demand is based on a best case analogy as to what happens on the supply side. So it doesn't really account for delays for new mines coming on or production issues or anything like that. So I would expect that the gap's actually bigger than what the WNA is forecasting.
You just mentioned delays. What's the sort of time frame? And again, let's look at yourself. You're in the exploration. How long would it take for somebody in the exploration phase to pretend, if they had a deposit and it became economic and they went through, because a lot of people just turn around and go, oh, well, you just find uranium and away you go. I want to, excuse the pun, dig a little bit into what it takes to go from there it is, we've found some, and we'll go into some of the terminology in a minute, all the way through to, right, we've got a mine and we can start entering into agreements.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I would say from resource definition to mine, it's normally about 10 years, plus or minus.
Wow.
In the uranium space.
Yep.
Now, of course, this can be a lot shorter. So it depends that, when you're looking out for people that you think, okay, these could get into production during this cycle, really pay attention to which jurisdiction they're in. Have they got their mining license? What other permits do they need to go through? Is it just, okay, we need a final investment decision from a board, Or, do they need to get a huge amount of financing? Think about maybe how they might want to achieve that financing. Does their market cap support it, or would they have to go out and get debt? Could they use offtake agreements as a way of getting some of that financing brought forward? So there's lots of different ways that you can finance uranium mines. So that's kind of the things that I would be looking for if I was to look at, companies coming up. Now, obviously, jurisdictions are different as well. Every jurisdiction takes a different amount of time to sort of have their permitting / mining licenses approved. And normally the more complicated the process, the longer it takes. So, for example, let's just say in Australia or Canada, you've got a federation. So you have federal rules, and then you also have state rules that you've got to, contend with. So normally when you've got two layers of rules on top of each other, the process is slightly longer than, say, for example, if you're somewhere like Namibia, which has just one set of rules that you have to contend with. So you're just sort of dealing with, one government agency as opposed to, a whole different bunch of government agencies. So I look at those sorts of things when I have a think about, how long do I think this company is going to take to get into production?
I think that was excellent. And look, let's talk process as well, because there are different types of uranium mines, if you like, and there's a lot of terminology that's thrown around. And in this conversation with you, it's the beginner's guide. Some of this terminology, people, when they hear talk, they go, well, I don't even know what that means. So let's go through some of that, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
And to start with, the different ways that you can mine uranium.
Yeah, so you will always hear about ISR, which is in situ leach recovery of uranium. So basically there's three mining methods in uranium. One is open pit mining, one is underground mining, and one is ISR. Now, ISR is actually the most common form of uranium mining in the world. It's just a bit of an unusual concept. So what you basically are doing is you're pumping fluids down and you're impregnating the ore body and taking up that, uranium through the solution that you have. So it's solution mining, essentially. It's normally acid that goes down. It's a very
So sorry to interrupt up to. So is uranium liquid?
No, it's not liquid. It turns it into a solution. So it runs through. So it only really works in permeable sort of deposits. So for example, ISR mining won't work in, certain rock types where there's a lot of clays and it's, really dense, right? But it will work really well in, really permeable ore bodies, which is why you tend to see it in the deserts of Australia and Kazakhstan and places like that, because it's much sandier. So basically the thing to think about with ISR is it's really cheap on the cost curve.
Right.
So it's a very cheap way of mining, and that's because you're basically not digging a big hole in the ground. You're just putting a series of pipes down, and processing is much simpler than other methods of mining. So that's the first form of mining. Then obviously the open pit mining, it's a very common method in places like Namibia. So of course the Rossing mine in Namibia, which has been operating for over 40 years, that's a big open pit mine. Next to that is the Husab mine, that's a big open pit mine. Langer Heinrich, which is, about to start production again, that's a big open pit mine. So they're three big open pit mines. And then in Canada, you have either open pit mines or underground mines. So they've had both over the years. So Rabbit Lake, for example, was a big open pit mine. Then, of course, Cigar Lake and MacArthur River are underground mines. They're actually mined with robots.
Wow.
And that's because the uranium is such high grade there. So they sit in about the middle of the cost curve. The more expensive ones are the low grade Namibian mines. And is that in terms of where they sit on the cost curve?
Is that more like a quarry operation?
Sorry?
Is that more like a quarry operation then, that sort of Namibia one, where are you just literally shifting dirt and pulling it out? I just want to find out a little bit about the process
Yeah,
itself.
it's a big earth moving operation.
Right.
Yes,
Okay.
it's definitely a big earth moving operation. Yeah.
Oh,
You're shifting
okay.
a lot of dirt.
So look, we're running out of time, but so ISR is the most what's the word I'm looking for? The most common one. Then you got open pit, you got underground. One other terminology I've heard a little bit about was non-conformity. Now, I don't want to go too technical. We're not geologists on this side of the bridge, if you like, but just some of the terminology that is used, I kind of scratch my head. What does that mean, non-conformity?
It's actually unconformity.
Oh, sorry.
And unconformity.
See?
That's all right. That's all right. So unconformity is actually a type of deposit in the Athabasca Basin of Canada, but it's also a type of deposit that's found in the Northern Territory and the Alligator River regions. So examples of unconformity related deposits, which is a geological term, is Jabiluka, Ranger. They would be unconformity related deposits. And then you would have Cigar Lake and MacArthur River, which are unconformity deposits in the Athabasca. So just to give you a real 101 on the geology of what unconformity means. So basically you have sandstone as the upper region of deposit. And then you have this sort of transition area, which is known as the unconformity, which then goes down into the basement rocks, right? And so often the deposit is right at that intercept between the basement rocks and the sandstone rocks, called the unconformity. And the reason why people talk about it so much is because that is where you have your mega high grade deposits. We're talking 20% uranium deposits. Like Hurricane, when that was discovered in the Athabasca Basin, they were like hitting 70% grades, which is 700,000 ppm compared to your Namibian grades, which are 500 ppm or 200 to 500 ppm. So
ppm is parts per million.
Parts per million, yes.
And I wanted to unpack that just briefly, if you wouldn't mind, because what makes a good grade or a non-good grade? Yeah.
Yeah, so grade is one of those really interesting things, right? I think it's what makes a deposit economic versus non-economic is really the more important question, right? So you can have grades that are 200 ppm, but you can have a size of an ore body which is 300,000 pounds of uranium, right? And that's a big ore body, right? But the 200 ppm is really low. So then you need to think about, well, how do you extract that uranium, and is it economic to extract that uranium, right? But then on the flip side, you might have like a deposit that's 10% uranium, right? But that comes with different issues. Like if it's in the unconformity, for example, it might be in really soft rock and they have to freeze the walls around it. They have to robotically mine it. So, that comes with different expenses. So they say that you would need 100 million pounds plus to kind of make that work. Then you have the basement hosted deposits, for example, in Canada, and that tends to be a lower grade than your 10 to 20% uranium. So it tends to sit in the sort of 0.3 to 0.5% range, which is kind of where the GMZ is located. Now, what's really interesting about those deposits is it's open pit in hard, competent rock. So the technical reality of those deposits is it's much easier to dig out of the ground. Therefore, it reduces cost dramatically, etc. So there's really a lot of factors that go into play as to whether something's economic or not. So it's funny because the Canadians think that 0.3 to 0.5%, which is still 5,000 ppm, is a low-grade deposit. But actually, technically speaking, it's still 3 to 5 times higher than the average grade that is mined globally. So it's high grade.
Average grade of what's mined globally at the moment?
It's about 1,500 ppm.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's really a function of the amount of ISR mining.
ISR being the in situ leach recovery. See?
Correct. Yes.
Learning. That's the most common one. That's the most cost effective.
Correct.
All right, we're running out. I really want you, if you wouldn't mind, just to wrap it up and help us to understand, what do you think are, and let's make it five things that you think people should be looking at in this space to, like, I guess, to make better and more well-informed decisions.
Well, jurisdiction is always number one in uranium, right? So you want to make sure that you are investing in a jurisdiction which is a uranium-friendly mining jurisdiction. So that would be my number one thing that I would say. And obviously, you know, there's three tremendous jurisdictions that you would want to be located in. So obviously Canada, which is, you know, the Athabasca Basin, Saskatchewan, anywhere in Canada, good place. You know, Australia, you know, South Australia, perhaps the Northern Territory, and then, you know, Namibia being the third option. So you can look at stocks on the ASX or TSX that are in both of those jurisdictions, right? So that would be the first thing I would look at. Then I, of course, would always look at the deposit, you know, how much, if it's an explorer, how much growth potential does it have? Does this thing have a hell of a lot of growth potential? That's something I would always pay attention to. So on the explorer side. Now, on the developer side, I'd be looking at NPVs. So NPV being a discounted cash flow, right? So what does the discounted cash flow look like and at what price? So are they using an $80 a pound uranium price, or are they using a $50 per pound uranium price? What's the sensitivity analysis around that? So that's the second thing I would look at. And then you just kind of make an assessment based on, you know, there's not many places you can invest in the uranium market. So you also need to think of, well, you know, where would all the funds invest?
Yes.
You know, so funds tend to invest in, you know, the bigger end of the companies, like, so I would look at that as well. And then of course you would look at, you know, management team. Do they know what they're doing? Have they done it before?
Yep.
So that would probably be my things that I would look for.
That's really good.
And, you know, yeah,
And so,
obviously deposit's always going to be the winner at the end of the day. But all these other things sort of come into play. And, you know, I think, as I said, the uranium market's going to be very strong going forward over the next few years. So, you know, it should be a great place to play.
Should be a great place to play. Final question or final comment from you. If you want to comment, you can turn around and tell me to bugger off. And that is, you know, you mentioned right at the start, Australia, you know, we've got one of the highest uranium in the ground globally. But of course, there are so many areas in Australia that we can't touch it. And that we touch, we export offshore. And I know it's a very sensitive topic in Australia at the moment. The price of electricity has gone through the roof, you know, and I scratch my head and I say, where are the policymakers that are going, it's zero carbon emission. It's actually going to be very cost effective because it's here. We don't need to do it. It's right here, ladies and gentlemen. I'd just love to hear your views if you wanted to comment on that, or maybe you just go, guess, I don't want to. Yep.
No, I'm 100% happy to comment on it. You know, one of the very frustrating things about being a taxpayer here is watching the government spend a whole bunch of my money on the renewable dream. Now, I don't have anything against renewables, but if you look at all the data around the world and countries that have gone into renewables, if they do not have baseload energy to back it up, which is carbon free, you might as well not be doing it, because they use coal or they use gas as an alternative source of electricity, right? Yep. So I think we just need to be very careful that we don't go down this pathway and, you know, we still don't have a solution for baseload. If I was a government policy maker, I would be looking at the long-term economics of, you know, nuclear energy as a baseload energy source in Australia, small modular reactors, plugging them into our old coal. It's a perfect solution. You don't have to upgrade, you know, your infrastructure around it, you know, and really, you know, I think in terms of our back pockets and what Australians are going to pay for it going forward, you know, it's a fantastic investment from the Australian government. So Look, that would be my say in it. I understand the Liberal Party is very much going down this pathway, and I think they're sensible in going down this pathway. I think the Labor government's views, frankly, are really old-fashioned, and they need to get with the program, because all around the world they're talking nuclear energy. So Australia's pretty much really left out in the dark when it comes to this issue now compared to the rest of the world.
And a lot of people out there always turning around and saying, why are we sending our precious resources overseas? That's because we have to, because we're not allowed to use it here in Australia. So my plea to everyone out there is get yourself educated, understand, and Siobhan just said it right then and there, small modular reactors. People don't realize that the technology is so different from many years ago. You wouldn't even know, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, Siobhan, you wouldn't know if you drove past one of those, they're called SMRs. There's a technology I know. These little small modular reactors are very, very, you can place them anywhere.
Yeah.
Very discreet.
They're a lot more discreet than the larger nuclear power plants. But, still, even compared to the footprint of anything else, it's a great form of electricity.
Yeah, go travel around France at the moment, and you wouldn't even know you were going past it. And I think France has got 78% is
nuclear power. Yes, but they actually use the old the larger nuclear power, and there's nothing wrong with large nuclear power, I should say.
Yeah.
The benefit of small modular reactors really is the cost, the fact that they can be scaled up, the fact that, the cost of capital to get them installed is a lot lower as well. So there's a few benefits there. And of course, the technology is fantastic, and they've got every safety mechanism that you could possibly have. So, great bit of technology, and they can be applied really all around Australia.
All right. So my plea to everybody in Australia is please get educated. And my comment I'm going to send this to you, the government, and perhaps you can get yourselves educated as well. And let's look at a zero carbon emission nuclear future for Australia. Now, that wasn't what this was about. This is about a beginner's guide to helping you, my audience out there, understand what to look for if you are going to get exposure to the uranium market, which seems to me right now to be on the up and up, or going from strength to strength, whichever way you want to look at it. Later in the year, I will be having a chat to Siobhan about her company. Not today. We've gone on for far too long today because there's so much to unpack. But her company is called 92 Energy, and the ASX code is 92E. My thanks to you, Siobhan, for joining us and helping us to unpack the uranium story today.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Kerry.